The hypothalamus and the pituitary. The hypothalamus is named for its position below the thalamus. Hypo means under. It is embryologically derived from the diencephalon and is known as the supreme leader of hormonal stimuli in the endocrine system. Hypothalamus anatomical location. If you had to give a more elaborate description of the location of the hypothalamus other than it's deep to the thalamus, you could say the hypothalamus caps the brainstem and forms the infralateral walls of the third ventricle. It extends from the optic chiasma to the posterior margin of the mammillary bodies. Between the optic chiasma and the mammillary bodies protrudes a thin stalk of hypothalamic tissue called the infundibulum that connects the base of the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus nuclei. I know you learned a lot in neuroanatomy about the many nuclei of the hypothalamus. Many of these nuclei produce and secrete hormones. In this course, we're only going to focus on the hormonal production of the arcuate, paraventricular, and supraoptic nuclei. As you know, the hypothalamus regulates the autonomic nervous system, which in turn regulates the function of our internal organs. It also plays a key role in the limbic system, influencing our emotions and sex drive. The hypothalamus is essential in maintaining homeostasis, such as our heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature, hunger, thirst, and circadian sleep-wake cycle, just to name a few. The primary way the hypothalamus influences these functions is through hormones. Looking at this simple diagram, we can see how essential chiropractic adjustments are in maintaining communication between the hypothalamus and peripheral tissues. And even though cranial nerves that arise from the brainstem do not exit through the IVF, an upper cervical subluxation could influence cerebrospinal flow and communication running in tracts between the spinal cord and the brainstem. Remember, the junction between the medulla and the spinal cord is right at the foramen magnum, or the occipital-atlantal joint. The hypothalamus produces hormones that control pituitary gland function. Before we get into how the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland, let me briefly describe its basic anatomy. The pituitary gland is made up of two separate lobes, the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. The anterior lobe, often referred to as the anterior pituitary, is controlled by hormones produced by the hypothalamus. The posterior lobe, or posterior pituitary, is controlled by nerve signals from the hypothalamus. How does the hypothalamus control the anterior pituitary? The hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary either with releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. The hypothalamus produces specific releasing and inhibiting hormones that target the release or prevent the release of specific anterior pituitary hormones. Specialized neurons located in the hypothalamic nuclei produce and secrete these stimulating and inhibiting hormones. These neurons transport the hormones down their fibers to the base of the hypothalamus called the median eminence. The hypothalamic hypophysioportal system is the vascular system that transports hormones released by the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. The hypothalamic hypophysioportal system consists of two capillary plexuses connected by portal veins or portal venules. The first and primary capillary plexus is located at the base of the hypothalamus called the median eminence. It receives arterial blood from the superior hypophyseal artery. The second capillary plexus is located within the anterior pituitary gland itself. Hormones released by hypothalamic neurons at the median eminence are picked up by the primary capillary plexus, then travel to the secondary capillary plexus located in the anterior pituitary through the portal veins. The releasing and inhibiting hormones that affect the anterior pituitary are gonadotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, corticotropic releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, prolactin inhibiting hormone, which is also dopamine, and growth hormone inhibiting hormone, also known as somatostatin. There are two other hypothalamic hormones we will cover in this course: antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin, and oxytocin. Here I've created a table listing the hypothalamic nuclei, the hormones they produce, the posterior lobe affected by those hormones, and the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary under the influence of the hypothalamic hormones. The supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei produce antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. It's not clear which one of those nuclei produces which one of those hormones, so I'll always pair it together. These hormones then travel to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, where they are stored until it's time for the release. Paraventricular nuclei produce cortical-releasing hormone, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone. The accurate nuclei produces prolactin inhibitory hormone, which is actually the same thing as dopamine, and it stimulates the anterior pituitary to inhibit the release of prolactin. The arcuate also produces growth hormone releasing hormone, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. The arcuate also produces gonadotropin releasing hormone, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to produce and secrete follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. It's not sure which nuclei produces thyroid releasing hormone, so you won't be expected to know that. Thyroid releasing hormone stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete thyroid stimulating hormone and sometimes prolactin. Still not sure exactly which nuclei produces growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which is also the same chemical compound known as somatostatin. When that hormone is released, it stimulates the anterior pituitary to stop producing growth hormone. And if enough of it's released, it'll also stop it from producing thyroid stimulating hormone. And because it's somatostatin, it also affects the release of insulin and glucagon. And we'll cover that later on when we get to those hormones. More about the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is also known as the hypophysis. It is considered the master gland of the endocrine system because it controls the functions of several other endocrine glands and endocrine tissues. The pituitary gland is really tiny, about the size of a garden pea. It is fascinating how such a tiny thing can have such a huge role in body function. The pituitary gland is located just behind the bridge of your nose. It is well protected, sitting within the silica turcica of the sphenoid bone. Pituitary gland details. The pituitary gland is physically connected to the hypothalamus by a hypophyseal stalk known as the infundibulum. As mentioned in slide 6, it has two distinct lobes, the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. Each lobe is made up of completely different tissue, and each lobe has different functions. The anterior lobe, or anterior pituitary, is also known as the adenohypophysis. It is formed by the pars discalis and the pars tuberalis, which is mostly epithelial tissue. I don't like how this drawing shows the pars tuberalis the same color as the posterior lobe. In class lecture, I use an eye pen to color it in during the presentation, but I haven't figured out how to do it with this voice recording presentation. So don't let the drawing confuse you. The posterior pituitary is also known as the neurohypophysis. It is formed by the pars nervosa. The posterior lobe is actually an extension of the hypothalamus and is made up of nervous tissue. Both lobes secrete hormones, but only the anterior pituitary lobe actually produces hormones. Embryological development. During the third week of development, the roof of the pharynx invaginates into the floor of the diencephalon, forming a pouch called Rathke's pouch. Since the pharynx is made up of epithelium, it explains why the mature anterior pituitary lobe is made up of epithelium. Now, if you remember in the previous lecture, I explained that endocrine glands are made up of epithelium because epithelium is the best secretory tissue in the body. This tissue origin of the anterior and posterior lobes explain why only the anterior pituitary actually produces hormones. Around that same time of development, the floor of the diencephalon, which is made out of neuroectoderm, forms a bud, which is the distal portion of the infundibulum that eventually becomes the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Anterior pituitary hormones. The anterior pituitary lobe produces several hormones. We're going to focus on the 6 primary hormones it produces. All hormones produced by the anterior pituitary are peptides. That means they are part of the most abundant class of hormones. They are water-soluble and can travel freely through the bloodstream, and they bind with specific serpentine G protein-linked receptors on the target cell. The 6 primary anterior pituitary hormones are growth hormone, also known as somatotropin, adrenocorticotropin, also known as corticotropin, thyroid stimulating hormone, also known as thyrotropin, prolactin, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. You will be responsible for knowing the acronyms for each hormone as we cover this course. I am a visual learner, so I put this diagram in the PowerPoint to help my visual learners remember the names of the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary, as well as the tissues that affect those hormones. Anterior pituitary secretory cells. The anterior pituitary is made up of different types of epithelial cells. Each of these specific secretory cells synthesizes one of the specific primary hormones of the anterior pituitary. Whenever you see the suffix tropes describing a cell, that means that cell produces and secretes something that will affect the function of another specific cell or tissue. The 6 types of cells we will cover are somatotropes, lactotropes, gonadotropes, corticotropes, and thyrotropes. Just by reading and hearing the names, you can probably speculate which cells produce which hormone. Hormones produced by anterior pituitary secretory cells. Here is a list of the anterior pituitary secretory cells and the hormones they produce. You will notice that I have percentages of the amounts of somatotropes and corticotropes listed. That is because hormones produced by anterior pituitary secretory cells. Here's a list of the anterior pituitary secretory cells and the hormones they produce. You will notice that I have percentages of the amount of somatotropes and corticotropes listed. That is because they make up the bulk of the anterior pituitary cellular mass. These 2 cells are the only ones that require you to know their percentages. Somatotropes make up about 30 to 40% of the anterior pituitary. They produce growth hormone. The corticotropes account for approximately 20% of the anterior pituitary cells. They produce a major hormone called adrenocorticotropic hormone. They also produce small amounts of beta endorphins, which are precursors to endorphins, the natural opiates that play a role in suppressing pain signals. We covered their properties in neuromuscular physiology. Corticotropes are also produce melanocyte stimulating hormone, which is nearly never released. However, we will see the effects of this hormone when we cover abnormal conditions associated with hyposecretion of the adrenal cortex hormones. Next are the thyrotropes. I am sure you were able to conclude that they produce thyroid stimulating hormone. The gonadotropes produce both follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. They're called gonadotropes because FSH and LH only affect the gonads. And last there are the lactotropes, also known as mammotropes. They produce prolactin. Prolactin has many roles in the endocrine system, but is mostly known for its ability to stimulate milk production in the female breasts. The name lactotropes comes from the word lactation, which means milk production. For the last slide, I made a table listing the anterior pituitary cells, the percentages of their mass in the gland and what they produce, and the target cell they affect. You will notice that these percentages do not add up to 100. All I need for you to remember about the percentages of the cells is that somatotropes make up the bulk of the anterior pituitary, then next corticotropes, and the rest only make up a small percentage of the mass. Somatotropes make growth hormone known as somatotropin, and they affect all body tissues. Corticotropes produce adrenocorticotropic hormone, and they affect the adrenal cortex. Thyrotropes produce thyroid-stimulating hormone, and they affect the thyroid gland. Gonadotropes make a follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and they affect the gonads. And lactotropes produce prolactin, and they affect the female breast.